Shadows in plain sight. The air was thick with the weight of an oncoming storm, low clouds pressing down on the city like a hand squeezing too hard. Even in the daytime, the light seemed muted, casting a grayish hue over the streets, the kind of day where people walked faster, heads down, eyes skimming the ground, avoiding everything and everyone. This was exactly the day Jeremiah Kane had chosen for his experiment. Jeremiah stood in front of a cracked mirror inside the barely lit maintenance room of the luxury high-rise he owned. His usual pristine reflection was absent, replaced instead by a man who could have been anyone, or no one at all. A man society had long since trained itself to ignore. His tailored suits were gone, replaced by worn jeans with a tear at the knee and a faded army green jacket that sagged at the shoulders. The shoes were the hardest part. His Italian leather loafers were replaced with muddy sneakers, their soles uneven and thinning at the heels. He had even let his stubble grow for the past few days, just enough to blur the sharpness of his jawline. His hair, normally swept back with precision, was hidden beneath a beanie that had definitely seen better days. The transformation was complete. "Sir," Leo's voice broke through the silence. His longtime driver stood at the door, hesitation tugging at his usual professional demeanor. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Jeremiah turned, lips tugging into a crooked smile. "How will I ever know what the world really thinks of me if all they ever see is money?" Leo exhaled, his hands clasped behind his back. "If anyone recognizes you, they won't." Jeremiah slid a burner phone into his jacket pocket. 2 hours. "That's all I need. If I'm not back by then, come find me." Leo's mouth pressed into a thin line, but he gave a reluctant nod. "Understood, sir." Jeremiah stepped out onto the sidewalk, and the transformation took hold immediately. The people streaming past him, some in business attire, others in gym clothes, barely registered his existence. No polite nods, no deferential smiles, no one stepping aside to clear a path. In his usual life, doors opened before he even reached them. Now he was just an obstruction to be maneuvered around. He made his way toward Mercer Park, a manicured stretch of green surrounded by upscale cafes, boutique shops, and offices. A place where well-dressed professionals walked their dogs, where yoga moms took power strolls, where no one ever really stayed unless they belonged. It was the perfect petri dish for his social experiment. He chose a bench near the park's fountain, the metal cold even through his jeans. For a few moments, it was peaceful. Birds picking at crumbs left behind by a family, the soft trickle of the fountain, the muted conversations of passing strangers. But then came the shift. It started subtly. A middle-aged man in a tailored blazer walked by, his eyes sliding over Jeremiah like water over glass, never quite making contact. A woman pushing the stroller steered slightly wider around the bench, her gaze flickering to him before snapping away. A jogger slowed, only to pull out his phone and glance at the screen. Whether pretending to check a notification or preparing to record, Jeremiah couldn't be sure. They weren't cruel. They weren't even direct. They were simply dismissing him, assigning him to a category without a second thought. He doesn't belong here. That unspoken truth echoed louder than words. It was fascinating and infuriating. The crunch of boots on gravel drew his attention to the patrol car idling at the park's entrance. 2 officers sat inside, one speaking into the radio, the other looking directly at Jeremiah. The scrutiny was sharp, practiced. He knew that gaze. It was the same look board members gave when evaluating a risky investment. Calculating, wary, and already half-decided. The car door swung open, and Sergeant Aaron Wells stepped out. Broad-shouldered, with a jaw like granite and eyes that had long since learned to see what they expected to see. His hand rested near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to send a message. Jeremiah didn't move. Wells approached with the casual authority of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Afternoon," he said, voice flat. "Mind telling me how long you've been sitting here?" Jeremiah leaned back, adopting the slouch of someone used to being dismissed. "Just passing through," he said, letting his voice rasp with weariness. "Needed somewhere to sit." Wells' eyes flicked over him, cataloging every frayed thread, every scuff, every signifier of otherness. "You from around here?" Jeremiah shrugged. "Does it matter?" "It does when we've had complaints about loitering." The word made Jeremiah's teeth clench. Loitering. The polite word for existing in a space you're not welcome. "Complaints from who?" Jeremiah asked. Wells didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his radio, muttering into it softly. Back up, or maybe just signaling that this situation was now official. Around them, the park shifted. Conversations lowered, eyes glanced away, but awareness buzzed in the air. Jeremiah's hands rested on his knees. "Am I breaking any laws, officer?" Wells' jaw tightened, the smallest crack in the mask. "Not yet. But you'd like me to leave anyway." "This is a public park," Wells said. "But it's a family-friendly area. People get nervous when they see someone hanging around." Jeremiah exhaled slowly, a laugh without humor. "So it's not what I've done. It's just how I look." Wells didn't answer. Silence stretched between them. The kind of silence Jeremiah knew well from corporate boardrooms, when power was about to shift and everyone waited to see which way the wind would blow. Another officer arrived. Officer Marquez, younger, wiry, trying to look relaxed, but already mirroring Wells' posture. "What's going on?" Marquez asked, though it was clear he'd already made his assumptions. "Individuals refusing to vacate," Wells said. "Vacate what?" Jeremiah said, his voice finally losing some of its forced calm. "I'm sitting on a bench, in a public park. That's not illegal." Marquez's brow furrowed, but Wells didn't falter. "If an officer gives you a lawful order to leave." "Because I'm sitting here." Jeremiah interrupted. "What exactly am I doing wrong?" The conversation was turning. A jogger nearby had stopped, phone held low but unmistakably recording. A woman with a dog stood further back, pretending to scroll through her phone but sneaking glances at the scene. Attention was gathering, but no one intervened. "You need to move along," Wells said, voice sharper now, "or we'll escalate this." Jeremiah stood slowly, not out of fear, but out of something heavier, resignation. "You want to arrest me for sitting down?" Wells' grip tightened on his cuffs. "Obstruction of public space." "Public space," Jeremiah repeated, the words dripping with irony. "Owned by the taxpayers. You work for them, right?" "You have somewhere else to be?" Wells asked, the edge of threat just under the surface. Jeremiah reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, carefully, and pulled out the prepaid phone. He tapped the screen, brought up a photo, and turned it around. It was a photo of himself, clean-shaven, standing beside the mayor at a charity event. The caption read, "Jeremiah Kane donates $500,000 to Community Revitalization Project." The silence was a living thing. Marcus took a step closer, eyes narrowing in disbelief. Wells' jaw flexed, the realization settling in. "That's me," Jeremiah said softly. "I own the 3 buildings across the street. I fund half the initiatives you take credit for, and you still wanted to cuff me." The color drained from Wells' face, replaced by the bitter mix of embarrassment and simmering anger. "That doesn't change the fact." "It changes everything," Jeremiah cut him off. "Because if I were anyone else, this would end differently." The storm in the sky broke, but the real storm had only begun. The cost of seeing clearly. The silence after Jeremiah's revelation was the kind that stretched wider than the sky. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the park's trees, sending dry grass skittering along the paved paths. And yet, somehow, the weight of it all pressed down heavier than any storm. Sergeant Aaron Wells stood rooted to the ground, face locked in a stiff grimace. Officer Marquez, still young enough to believe in the clean lines between right and wrong, shifted uncomfortably. The phone in Jeremiah's hand was still raised, screen glowing, proof undeniable. You're that Jeremiah Kane? Marcus asked, his voice dropping in pitch, as if speaking the name too loudly would break something fragile. Yeah, Jeremiah said. That's me. Except today, I guess I'm nobody. The officers exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication born out of years patrolling together, where whole conversations could pass through a glance, a flicker of muscle in the jaw. But this situation wasn't in their playbook. There were no training manuals for detaining the man who signed donation checks larger than their annual salaries. Wells stepped back, not fully retreating, but enough to put distance between himself and the bench where Jeremiah had sat. That small movement said more than words. Control, authority, all of it slipping from his fingers. This doesn't have to be a big deal, Wells said, though even he didn't believe it. We can chalk this up to misunderstanding. Jeremiah's voice was calm, but there was steel under it. I've heard that before. It's a misunderstanding when people like me don't fit into the categories you've decided exist. It's a misunderstanding when someone doesn't look the way you expect. He lowered the phone, stuffing it back into his jacket. His hand brushed against the scratchy fabric. Cheap, stiff, uncomfortable. A perfect costume for the invisible. But I'm not interested in misunderstandings today, Sergeant. Jeremiah's eyes locked onto Wells. I'm interested in clarity. Around them, the watchers were gathering. No longer just curious joggers and dog walkers. There was a man in a dress shirt holding a takeaway coffee, phone raised in his other hand. A teenage girl sat cross-legged on the grass, filming from below. A group of cyclists slowed, clustering at the park's edge, murmuring to each other. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a stage. You know what I've spent the last year doing? Jeremiah asked, taking a step forward. I've spent it funding housing programs, job training, addiction recovery, all the things that people like you say those people need. I've met them, sat with them, I've heard their stories. And you know the one thing they all say. Neither officer answered. Jeremiah didn't expect them to. They all say the worst part isn't the hunger or the cold. It's the invisibility. The way you all look through them like glass. His voice sharpened. Unless you need someone to blame for a broken window or a stolen purse, then suddenly they're not invisible anymore. They're suspects. Mr. Kane, I understand you're upset. Wells started, but Jeremiah cut him off with a sharp laugh. Upset? He shook his head. No, Sergeant. I'm furious. Not for me. I'll go back to my penthouse, my meetings, my name. But what about the man who really sits on this bench tomorrow? What happens to him when he doesn't have a news article to flash in your face? Wells' jaw worked, grinding frustration and embarrassment into silence. Marcus's eyes darted to the crowd, the phones, the faces waiting for someone to slip, someone to say something they couldn't unsay. Sergeant, Marcus whispered, voice tight. We need to de-escalate. No, Jeremiah said firmly. We need to escalate. You started this, Sergeant. Now let's show everyone exactly how it plays out. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing this moment wasn't just his. It belonged to every man and woman whose humanity had been siphoned out by uniforms, regulations, and the quiet belief that certain people didn't belong in certain places. Wells' nostrils flared. You're trying to make a spectacle. No, Jeremiah said softly. I'm trying to make you see. Marcus tugged at Wells' sleeve, subtly pulling him aside. They turned, whispering fiercely, though their hushed conversation carried in the charged silence. Jeremiah could almost hear it, the clash between pride and caution, the weight of public exposure against the instinct to maintain control. The crowd edged closer. Should we call the captain? Marcus asked, his voice just loud enough for Jeremiah to catch. Wells didn't answer. His face was a mask of competing impulses, the rigid authority of someone who had spent years being obeyed, fighting against the quiet realization that he'd been caught playing the wrong game with the wrong opponent. Jeremiah could have ended it there. He could have let them walk away with their tails tucked, let the story filter through the local news cycle for a day or two before fading into the noise. But that would have been the easy way. And Jeremiah Kane hadn't built his empire on easy choices. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice just enough to cut through the tension. Do you all want to know why this happened? Eyes locked onto him. Phones lifted higher. The park was silent, but for the rustling leaves and the faint trickle of the fountain. It's because I wore the wrong jacket, Jeremiah said, spreading his arms. The wrong shoes. Because I sat too still, too long, in a place they decided I didn't belong. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own quiet prejudices reflected back at them. This isn't about me, Jeremiah continued. It's about every person you walk past without seeing, every man and woman you cross the street to avoid. You assume you know their story. You assume they're dangerous, or lazy, or broken. But you don't know a damn thing. Wells' face burned red. His hands balled into fists at his sides. And these officers, Jeremiah gestured toward Wells and Marquez, they're not bad men. They're just men trained to see the world in two colors, belonging and threat. Today, I was a threat, because I didn't belong in the nice park, on the nice bench, with the nice families. The weight of it all hung thick in the air, a heavy truth no one could ignore. Mr. Kane, Marcus said, stepping forward. His voice was careful, measured. We had no way of knowing that I was rich. Jeremiah's smile was cold. That's the point. The crowd stirred, voices rising in quiet agreement. We didn't mean. Mark started, but Jeremiah cut him off again. You meant exactly what you did, Jeremiah said. And so does everyone else who looks at someone struggling and assumes they deserve it. That's what has to change. Wells took a step back, his eyes flickering between Jeremiah and the growing crowd. This was no longer about the law or procedure. This was about losing control of the story. And for someone like Wells, that was the ultimate defeat. Jeremiah took a breath, his voice softening just a fraction. I'm not asking for an apology. I don't need one. But I am asking you to remember this the next time you see someone sitting on a bench, wearing the wrong jacket, in the wrong place. He let that settle before turning, walking away without waiting for a response. The crowd parted, phones still filming, capturing every step. Wells and Marquez stood frozen, left behind in the wreckage of their own assumptions. As Jeremiah reached the park's edge, Leo's sleek black sedan was already idling at the curb. The door opened without a word, and Jeremiah slid inside. Leo glanced at him through the rearview mirror, eyes full of the questions he knew better than to ask. Where to, sir? Leo asked instead. Jeremiah leaned his head back, eyes closing for a moment. Home, he said softly. But first, the office. I have a press release to write. Leo nodded, pulling into traffic. Behind them, the park faded into the distance, but the weight of what happened there would travel much further. The reckoning and the ripple. The city skyline gleamed in the distance, its glass towers catching the late afternoon sun. Inside the sleek corner office on the 49th floor, Jeremiah Kane stood with his hands braced against the window, forehead resting lightly against the cool glass. From here, the park was a mere dot, a patch of green tucked between gray streets. From here, it was impossible to tell that a single bench had become the epicenter of a reckoning. Leo stood silently behind him, his usual composure intact, though his hands were clasped tighter than normal. He'd been with Jeremiah long enough to understand when his employer's silence was contemplation, and when it was the gathering storm. You're trending, Leo said softly, breaking the quiet. Jeremiah straightened, exhaling as if he'd been holding his breath since the moment he left that bench. I figured. He turned, gesturing to the screen on the wall, where a live feed of news headlines rolled like a digital tide. Billionaire Jeremiah Kane mistaken for homeless man, harassed by police. Viral video sparks national debate. Profiling in plain sight. Social experiment exposes how society judges the poor. From boardroom to bench, what happens when wealth disappears? The headlines were relentless. Jeremiah had only needed to release one clip, 45 seconds of footage taken directly from his own hidden camera, to set the match to dry kindling. Social media exploded. News outlets followed. By morning, national morning shows were already dissecting the Kane experiment, pitting talking heads against each other, debating whether it was a PR stunt or a necessary wake-up call. But Jeremiah wasn't interested in debates. He was interested in impact. He moved to his desk, scrolling through messages flooding his phone. There were offers for interviews. Every major network wanted him. There were calls from fellow billionaires, some congratulating him for exposing the truth, others warning him that stirring the pot was bad for business. He didn't care. He called his assistant. Draft a press release. No spin, just the facts. Make sure you emphasize one thing. I'm not the story. The system is. On it, she replied, voice crisp, no questions asked. Leo cleared his throat. You know they're going to push back, right? Jeremiah gave a tired smile. They always do. The pushback started within hours. The city's police department released a statement, a carefully worded, overly polished attempt to shift responsibility without admitting fault. It praised officers for their vigilance, emphasized that no formal arrest had been made, and framed the entire incident as a regrettable misunderstanding stemming from public safety concerns. Jeremiah watched the press conference from his penthouse, arms crossed, face unreadable. Sergeant Wells stood at the edge of the frame, his jaw tight, his face pale with anger barely concealed behind the veneer of professionalism. Officer Marquez was absent, likely on paid leave until the storm blew over. Mr. Kane himself has expressed no interest in filing a complaint, the police chief said, plastering on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We consider the matter closed. Jeremiah snorted softly. They don't get to decide when this ends. Leo, who had been quietly refilling Jeremiah's coffee, paused. What's your next move? Jeremiah's smile turned razor sharp. We go deeper. The next morning, Jeremiah Kane took the podium himself. Not at a gala, not at a shareholder meeting, but on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by reporters, activists, and everyday citizens who had gathered after seeing his video. His clothes were sharp again, tailored slate suit, silver cufflinks, leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. But the man beneath those clothes was different now, sharper, less patient. He didn't read from a statement. He spoke from the storm inside him. Let's get one thing clear, he began, voice carrying over the hum of the crowd. This is not about me. I will be fine. My name buys me the benefit of the doubt. My bank account shields me from the worst of this system. But I'm not here for me. He let that sit for a beat. I'm here for the man who actually sleeps on that bench. The woman pushing a shopping cart who gets asked to move along every day. The kid who can't sit in a park without someone assuming he's up to no good. Flashes went off. Cameras caught every flicker of emotion in his face. You all saw what happened when I was mistaken for someone without money, when I didn't have the armor of wealth wrapped around me. And you know what's terrifying? That wasn't even the worst of it. That was the polite version. Because they thought they could still control the outcome. Imagine how much worse it is for the people who can't pull a name out of their pocket to save themselves. The crowd was silent, hanging on his words. This isn't about one officer or one policy. It's about the entire framework that teaches us to see poverty as dangerous, to see struggle as failure, to see people who've lost everything as threats instead of neighbors. He let his voice harden. I've spent my life building wealth, but what good is all that wealth if I can't use it to buy the one thing money shouldn't be required for? Basic human dignity. The applause started slow, then swelled until it filled the plaza. And I'm not stopping here, Jeremiah promised. Today, I'm launching the Belonging Project, a nationwide initiative that will document, expose, and fight the quiet discrimination that happens every day to people who don't look right. We'll fund legal defense for those targeted, lobby for policy changes, and put pressure on every city and department that tolerates profiling. He took a step forward, staring directly into the cluster of cameras. And I'll say this to every officer, every politician, every person who watches that video and feels defensive. If you're not part of the solution, you're the problem. The crowd roared. Jeremiah stepped back, hands loose at his sides, heart pounding not from nerves, but from the exhilarating clarity of purpose. This was why he built his fortune, not for penthouses or yachts or power, but for this, for change. Over the next month, the Kane experiment became something bigger than any viral video. The Belonging Project launched with millions in seed funding from Jeremiah's own fortune, but it didn't stop there. Donations poured in from people across the country, each dollar accompanied by stories. Stories of being profiled, ignored, targeted for nothing more than existing. The project's first order of business: training law enforcement officers on unconscious bias, not the watered-down kind departments did to check a box, but real, unflinching education led by the very people who had been profiled themselves. Formerly homeless men and women, ex-convicts, people whose skin color or clothing or mere presence had made them suspects before they'd said a word. Some departments resisted. Others, under mounting public pressure, embraced the opportunity. And as for Sergeant Wells, he resigned 6 weeks after the video went viral, citing personal reasons. Jeremiah never spoke to him again. Not because he hated the man, but because Wells wasn't the point. He was a symptom. And Jeremiah had learned the hard way that fixing symptoms wasn't enough. You had to tear down the system that created them. Months later, Jeremiah returned to the park. This time, no disguise. He sat on that same bench, watching the world move around him. A young man, early 20s, scruffy, carrying a battered backpack, approached cautiously, eyeing the bench like it was forbidden territory. Jeremiah slid over, making room. "Plenty of space," he said softly. The man hesitated, then sat. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Sometimes silence was enough. Jeremiah leaned back, sunlight on his face, and smiled. This time, he belonged.